Good evening, and welcome back to Mystic Nightfall. I'm so glad you've settled in with us once again. Before we begin tonight's journey, let me know where you're listening from, if you'd like. Get comfortable, brew yourself some tea if you need it, adjust the lighting to your preference, and let's venture together into the ancient world of Homer's timeless epics. Tonight we're exploring a story that has echoed through more than 2.5 millennia, a story of heroes torn between duty and rage, of monsters both terrible and tragic, of journeys that span entire lifetimes, and of a love so steadfast it defies the cruelest winds of fate. We're diving deep into Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, those foundational pillars of Western literature that gave shape to how we understand heroism itself, how we conceive of struggle, and how we imagine the relationship between mortals and the divine forces that govern the universe. There's something almost sacred about returning to these texts, because they're not merely stories. They're time machines. They're keys that unlock chambers in our collective memory, rooms where the ancient Greeks stored their deepest understandings of what it means to be human. They grappled with honor and shame, with mortality and glory, with the tension between individual desire and collective responsibility. And remarkably, 2,700 years later, we still find ourselves wrestling with these very questions. The echoes haven't faded. If anything, they've grown louder. But before we plunge into the blood-soaked fields of Troy, or the wine-dark sea that Odysseus crossed, we need to understand the origins of these works themselves. The Iliad and Odyssey are believed to have been composed somewhere between 800 and 750 before the birth of Christ, though scholars continue to debate the precise dates with a passion that borders on obsessive. What we do know is that these poems emerged from an extraordinarily rich oral tradition, stories told and retold around fires, in great halls, sung by bards who shaped and reshaped them with each performance, passing them down through generations before they were ever committed to written form. Homer himself remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Ancient Greece debated endlessly about whether he was a blind poet from Ionia, whether he was even one person or many, whether he truly existed or was himself a legend. Some accounts claim he lived 400 years before Herodotus, the great historian, which would push him back to around 900 before Christ. Others, more conservative in their estimates, suggest a date closer to 750. We may never know for certain, but what matters is that his work fundamentally changed the landscape of human creativity. He established the epic poem as a genre, and in doing so, he gave future writers a template for exploring humanity at its most exalted and most flawed. The composition of both epics represents the culmination of centuries of oral tradition. Scholars have identified that the poems likely drew from material dating back to the Mycenaean civilization, though they were refined, structured, and polished by later hands. The development from short, separate oral songs to the vast, cohesive narratives we have today probably took roughly 400 years, a testament to how deeply these stories mattered to the ancient Greeks and how carefully they tended them. Now, to understand these epics, we must first understand the Trojan War itself, at least as mythology presents it. For the ancient Greeks, the Trojan War was not merely a story. It was the story, the central event around which all of Greek heroic culture revolved. It was dated by classical scholars to somewhere around the 12th or 13th century before Christ, the tail end of the Bronze Age, an era when great palatial civilizations rose and fell like tides. Archaeological excavations in modern-day Turkey have confirmed that Troy did indeed exist, that it was a wealthy, fortified city, and that it was destroyed at least once during this period. But as you might expect, the mythology surrounding the war is far more elaborate and dramatic than archaeological remains suggest. The war's origins, according to Greek tradition, trace back to a single moment of cosmic discord. Imagine this, a wedding celebration of breathtaking magnificence. The god Zeus himself has arranged the nuptials of Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea nymph of otherworldly grace. The wedding is a gathering of divine power. All the Olympian gods and goddesses have been invited to witness the union. It is meant to be an occasion of perfect harmony and celebration. But there is one goddess who was not invited, and her absence is a wound that will never heal. Her name was Eris, goddess of discord, strife, and quarrel. She was feared by gods and mortals alike because she possessed the uncanny ability to sow chaos wherever she walked. The Olympians, in their wisdom, or perhaps in their presumption, decided that her presence would be toxic to the occasion. So they excluded her. They thought, perhaps, that what the goddess of discord could not see, could not harm. But Eris was not one to be cast aside without retaliation. While the wedding festivities reached their apex, while gods and goddesses mingled in their divine pleasure, Eris arrived at the celebration, not in body, but in effect. She cast something into the midst of the gathered pantheon, a single golden apple, radiant and perfect, inscribed with 3 words that would change the trajectory of human history. To the fairest, the inscription read. Immediately, 3 of the most powerful goddesses claimed the apple. Hera, Zeus's wife, queen of the heavens, radiant with the authority of the throne, insisted that the apple belonged to her. Athena, born fully formed from Zeus's head, embodiment of wisdom and strategic warfare, stepped forward to claim it as her own. And Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and desire, whose very presence could make the knees of mortals and immortals alike go weak, demanded that the apple was hers by right of her incomparable beauty. An argument erupted among the 3 goddesses, not merely a disagreement, but a fundamental clash of competing claims to supremacy. Hera believed her status as queen of the gods made her the fairest. Athena contended that her wisdom and her role in civilization made her superior. Aphrodite simply smiled, confident that beauty outweighed any other consideration. The 3 would not yield to one another. None of them could overpower the others. And so Zeus, ever the strategist, yet not wishing to incur the wrath of any of his most significant divine beings, made a decision that would echo through the centuries. He would appoint a judge, a mortal judge, someone whose choice could not be questioned as favoritism toward the divine realm. And he selected a young man, a prince of distant Troy named Paris, the son of King Priam. Paris was tending his herds on Mount Ida, far from the complications of court, when Hermes, messenger of the gods, appeared before him and informed him of his role. He was to decide, once and for all, which of the 3 goddesses was the fairest. Now understand the position this put the young man in. How does a mortal refuse a divine command? How does anyone make such a judgment without incurring the enmity of 2 of the most powerful beings in existence? Paris knew that whatever choice he made, he would create 2 enemies among the gods, and those enemies would have very long memories. But the goddesses were also shrewd. As they approached the young man on Mount Ida, they began to offer him incentives. Hera promised that if Paris chose her, she would make him king of all men, supreme ruler of the earth. The promise of universal dominion hung before him like a jewel of unimaginable value. Athena, next, offered him victory in all warfare, the assurance that he would never know defeat in battle, that his name would ring out in the annals of military history, the promise of invincibility, of eternal triumph. And then came Aphrodite. She offered something different, something more intimate, more personally transformative than either power or military supremacy. She promised him the most beautiful woman in the world, a wife of incomparable loveliness, someone who would be his devoted companion and share his life. It was a promise not of dominion over others, but of the deepest connection between two souls, of romantic fulfillment and domestic bliss. Paris, whether foolish or simply human, chose Aphrodite. He placed the golden apple into the hands of the goddess of love and beauty, and with that single gesture, he set the stage for a war that would last a decade, consume thousands of lives, and reshape the entire Eastern Mediterranean world. Hera and Athena, spurned by the judgment, were not forgiving. They were, in fact, deeply insulted. Their enmity toward Troy would become legendary. But Aphrodite was true to her word. She kept her promise to Paris with the devotion of a goddess who honors her bonds. She would grant him the most beautiful woman in the world. That woman's name was Helen, and she was the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. Helen's story is itself wrapped in mythology and mystery. She was born of divine seed, the daughter of Zeus himself, who had taken the form of a swan to seduce her mother, Leda. This divine heritage had granted her a beauty so extraordinary that suitors had come from across the Greek world seeking her hand. Before she married Menelaus, her beauty had caused such disputes among the competing suitors that a crisis threatened to tear Greek society apart. It was only through the wisdom of the elder Odysseus, king of Ithaca, who proposed that all the suitors should bind themselves with an oath to accept whoever Helen chose and to defend that choice with their lives, that peace had been achieved. Helen had chosen Menelaus, and they had married, settling in Sparta, where they lived in what appeared to be contentment. They had a daughter together, Hermione. Menelaus was a decent enough king, though he lived somewhat in the shadow of his far more famous brother, Agamemnon, who ruled at Mycenae, the greatest power in the Greek world. Then Paris came to Sparta. He arrived, according to some accounts, under the pretext of a diplomatic mission, perhaps seeking guest friendship, as was customary in ancient Greek society. Menelaus received him with hospitality, as the code of honor demanded. The two men dined together, feasted together, and Paris was introduced to the royal household, and there he saw Helen. What happened next is described in various ways throughout the ancient sources. Some accounts suggest that Paris and Helen fell into an immediate, passionate love affair. Others speak of seduction, of Aphrodite's direct intervention, ensuring that Helen's affections shifted from her husband to the Trojan prince. What seems clear is that Helen, whether through genuine feeling, through divine manipulation, or through some combination of both, left Sparta with Paris. She abandoned her husband, her child, her homeland, and sailed with the Trojan prince back to Troy. To Menelaus, this was not merely a personal betrayal. It was a catastrophe of the highest order. His honor had been shattered. The wife of the king, the most beautiful woman in Greece, had been taken by a foreigner, and for Menelaus to let this stand would be to announce to the entire Greek world that he was weak, that he could not protect what was his, that he was unworthy of kingship itself. Menelaus went to his brother Agamemnon, the high king, the supreme commander of all the Greek forces, and told him what had transpired. Agamemnon, seeing both the personal wrong to his brother and the broader implications for Greek honor and unity, made a decision that would shape the next decade of history. He would call upon all of Greece to assemble. He would invoke the oath that all the suitors of Helen had sworn, that they would unite to defend her marriage. And he would lead a vast expedition across the sea to Troy to recover Helen and punish the Trojans for their outrage. The response was staggering. Kings and warriors from across the Greek world answered the call. From Mycenae came Agamemnon himself, supreme commander of the expedition. From Ithaca came the cunning Odysseus, whose wisdom and strategic thinking would prove invaluable. From Phthia came Achilles, the greatest warrior of the age, a demigod whose father, Peleus, was human, but whose mother, Thetis, was a sea goddess who had done everything in her power to make him nearly invincible. The Achaeans, as the Greeks were called, assembled a fleet of roughly 1,000 ships, each carrying between 50 and 100 warriors, plus attendants, supplies, and equipment. The numbers involved were staggering for the ancient world. This was not a small raiding party. This was a national mobilization of unprecedented scale. The Greeks sailed across the Aegean Sea, and they arrived at the walls of Troy, a wealthy, powerful city situated in what is now northwestern Turkey, strategically positioned where Europe and Asia meet. According to tradition, they laid siege to Troy for 10 long years, unable to breach the city's formidable walls, which, legend had it, had been built by the gods Apollo and Poseidon themselves. The Iliad, Homer's first great epic, does not tell the entire story of the Trojan War. Rather, it focuses on a single, crucial year, the 10th and final year of the war. It is, in a sense, the climax of a 10-year narrative, the moment when the accumulated tensions and grievances between the Greeks and Trojans finally reach their breaking point. And the pivot around which this year turns is not, surprisingly, the abduction of Helen or the conflict between Greeks and Trojans as nations. Instead, it is a quarrel between two men, both Greeks, both commanders of vast forces, and the feud between them will fundamentally alter the trajectory of the war. The poem opens with an invocation to the Muse, the goddess of poetry and inspiration. Homer calls upon her to sing of something very specific: the wrath, the terrible anger of Achilles, son of Thetis. This anger, Homer tells us, brought countless sorrows upon the Achaeans, and it caused the deaths of many brave warriors whose souls were sent down to Hades' realm, while their bodies became food for dogs and birds. It is an almost apocalyptic opening, setting the tone immediately that what follows will be dark, violent, and marked by irreversible loss. The Iliad begins with a council, a gathering of the Achaean leaders. The Greeks have just captured a nearby city, Chryse, and among the spoils they have taken is a beautiful young woman named Chryseis. She falls into the possession of Agamemnon, the supreme commander. However, Chryseis' father is Chrysis, a priest of Apollo, the sun god. He comes to the Greek camp and begs Agamemnon to return his daughter, offering ransom for her freedom. He appeals to Agamemnon's sense of honor, to the customs of warfare, and to the fear that might come from offending a priest of the gods. Agamemnon refuses. Not merely does he refuse to return the girl, He insults the old priest, driving him away from the camp with threats and words of contempt. Chrysis, devastated, goes to the shore and prays to Apollo. And Apollo hears his prayer. The god, angered by the disrespect shown to his priest, sends a terrible plague upon the Achaean army. Day after day, the disease rages through the camp. Warriors fall sick and die. The funeral pyres burn constantly, filling the air with smoke. The Greeks, once so confident in their eventual victory, begin to despair. They sense that the gods themselves have turned against them. Something must be done to appease the divine wrath. Achilles, recognizing the crisis, calls an assembly of all the Achaean leaders. He demands that they address the plague, that they discover its cause and do whatever is necessary to remedy it. The seer Calchas, a prophet who understands the will of the gods through reading omens, stands forward and reveals the truth. It is Apollo's anger that is causing the plague, he explains. Apollo was offended by Agamemnon's treatment of the priest Chrysis. There is only one way to appease the god. Chryseis must be returned to her father, and a hecatomb, 100 oxen, must be sacrificed to Apollo as compensation. Now Agamemnon faces a choice. He can return Chryseis, satisfy the gods, save his army from plague, and thereby lose face before the Greeks. Or he can refuse, maintain his pride and his possession of the woman, and watch his soldiers continue to die. For a moment, it seems that Agamemnon will do the right thing, make the sacrifice of his pride for the welfare of his army. He agrees to return Chryseis. But then he makes a terrible calculation. If he is to give up his captive woman, his symbol of victory, and his personal possession, then he requires compensation. He requires another woman to replace Chryseis, another symbol of his status and his military success. And the woman he chooses to take is Briseis, who belongs to Achilles. Achilles, hearing this, feels a rage unlike any he has experienced before. It is not merely anger at the loss of a possession. It is a profound sense of dishonor, a wound to his status, to his place among the Greek commanders. Briseis was not some anonymous captive to him. She was his war prize, his recognized possession, the public symbol of his military contributions to the cause. For Agamemnon to take her is, in Achilles' view, to publicly humiliate him, to declare that the supreme commander does not acknowledge Achilles' authority or his standing. Achilles stands before Agamemnon and speaks words filled with hurt and fury. He accuses the older man of greed, of using his position to take what belongs to others. He reminds Agamemnon that it is he, Achilles, who does the real fighting, who puts himself in danger, who kills the most enemies. And yet, when the prizes are divided, Agamemnon takes the largest share simply because he holds the highest rank. Achilles is devastated, but more than that, he is enraged. In this moment, as the two commanders hurl insults at each other, Athena appears to Achilles, visible only to him. The goddess of wisdom counsels him to refrain from physical violence against Agamemnon. It would be a sacrilege for one Greek to kill another on the eve of battle against the Trojans. But Achilles, Athena assures him, will be compensated. He will be given 3 times as many gifts as Agamemnon is taking from him. His honor will be restored. This divine reassurance does not calm Achilles' rage, but it does redirect it. Rather than attacking Agamemnon physically, Achilles makes a pronouncement that will change everything. He announces that he will no longer fight for the Greeks. He will withdraw from the war. He and his troops, the Myrmidons, will sit in their camp by the shore and will not lift a finger to defend the Greek cause. Let Agamemnon command the battle without him. Let the Greeks try to defeat Troy without the mightiest warrior they possess. For Achilles, this makes perfect sense. If Agamemnon has disrespected him by taking his war prize, then Achilles will hurt Agamemnon by withholding his military services. Agamemnon values the outcome of the war, the prestige of leading the Greek forces to victory. Achilles will deny him that victory. It is, in a sense, a form of divine punishment, an eye for an eye, a withdrawal matching Agamemnon's taking. But Achilles prays to his mother, Thetis, asking her to work on his behalf with Zeus. His mother, being a goddess and having connections to the highest powers of the universe, might be able to convince Zeus to turn the tide of the war against the Greeks, to make the battle go poorly for them. In this way, Agamemnon and the other Greek leaders will see, through bitter experience, that they were wrong to dishonor Achilles. They will come to recognize his value, and they will beg him to return to the war. Thetis, though heartbroken because she knows a prophecy stating that Achilles is fated to die in Troy, goes to Olympus to petition Zeus. She speaks to the king of the gods, reminding him that she once saved him from a dangerous rebellion, and therefore he owes her a favor. She asks him to turn the tide of the war against the Greeks, to make them suffer, so that Agamemnon will be forced to recognize what he has done to her son. Zeus, reluctantly, agrees. He makes a promise to Thetis that he will alter the course of the war in order to bring honor to Achilles, even if it means the Greeks will suffer greatly. And with that promise made, a chain of events is set in motion that will lead to the deaths of thousands. The Trojan War, from this point forward, is shaped not primarily by military strategy or by the relative numbers of soldiers, but by the feud between Achilles and Agamemnon. With Achilles withdrawn from battle, the Greeks lose their greatest warrior. The Trojans, under Hector, begin to gain the upper hand. They launch increasingly successful attacks against the Greek encampment. The tide of the war, which had been grinding slowly against Troy, suddenly shifts. Now we must speak of Hector, for he is in many ways Achilles' mirror image, his opposite number among the Trojan forces. If Achilles represents the fury of youth, the warrior who fights for personal glory and is willing to sacrifice anything for honor, then Hector represents something more complex. He is also a warrior, also a fighter of great skill and courage. But Hector fights, fundamentally, for his city and for his family. He fights because it is his duty, not because he desires glory for its own sake. Hector is the eldest son of Priam, king of Troy. He is married to Andromache, a woman of wisdom and grace, and they have a young son named Astyanax. In many ways, Hector is a family man caught up in circumstances not of his making. He did not approve of Paris's abduction of Helen. He understood that it was a foolish action that would bring calamity upon Troy. Yet, because it was his brother, and because his duty as a son and as a prince required him to defend his city, Hector took up arms and became the chief defender of Troy against the assembled might of Greece. As the war progresses, Hector distinguishes himself as a warrior of tremendous skill and courage. He is not quite the supernatural fighter that Achilles is. No demigod blood flows through his veins, but he is nonetheless nearly unmatched in combat. More importantly, He is a leader. His soldiers follow him because they trust him, because they see in him someone who fights not for personal gain, but for the defense of their city and their families. He is even beloved by the goddess Athena, though she opposes the Trojan cause because of his virtue and his nobility. When Achilles withdraws from the war, the balance of power shifts noticeably in the Trojans' favor. Hector leads increasingly successful assaults against the Greek forces. He pushes them back, drives them toward their ships, and threatens to burn the entire Greek fleet. The Greeks, watching their forces deteriorate in the absence of Achilles, become desperate. They send an embassy to Achilles, asking him to return to the war, offering him gifts and apologies from Agamemnon. But Achilles refuses. His pride has been too deeply wounded. Yet there is another factor at work in the Iliad, one that is almost as important as the human drama of Achilles and Agamemnon. The gods themselves are deeply invested in the outcome of the Trojan War, and they intervene constantly. Some gods support the Greeks, others support the Trojans, and their interventions shift the balance of the mortal war in profound ways. Athena and Hera, remember, were deeply insulted by Paris's judgment at Mount Ida. They both desired the golden apple, and both were passed over in favor of Aphrodite. This cosmic insult translates into active support for the Greek cause. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, guides the Greek warriors in battle, granting them strength and inspiration. She guides Diomedes, one of the great Greek warriors, through a rampage of destruction against the Trojans. She protects Odysseus and gives him counsel. Hera, queen of the heavens, also supports the Greeks actively, and she even deceives Zeus, her husband, to try to help them gain advantage. On the Trojan side, Aphrodite supports her chosen hero, Paris, though Paris himself is portrayed as something of a coward, more interested in personal pleasure than in warfare. Apollo, the sun god, supports Troy as well. He is a master archer and a devastating warrior, and he uses his powers to protect Hector and to inflict harm on the Greeks. Ares, the god of war, also tends to side with the Trojans, though he is portrayed somewhat comically as being bested by Athena in combat and complaining loudly about it. Zeus, technically, is supposed to remain neutral, having promised not to favor either side. Yet his neutrality is complicated by his promise to Thetis. He cannot openly help the Greeks without violating his promise. But he also cannot fully support the Trojans without angering his wife Hera. So Zeus engages in subtle manipulations, attempting to shape the course of the war in ways that will bring honor to Achilles while minimizing the damage to the Greeks, an impossible balancing act that leads to much divine frustration and argument. The first 9 books of the Iliad cover these events and set the stage for the tragedy that will unfold. For the core of the Iliad, the moment around which everything pivots, is the death of Patroclus. And to understand Patroclus's death and its significance, we must first understand Patroclus himself and his relationship with Achilles. Patroclus entered Achilles' life as a child, a young boy who was exiled from his homeland after an accidental killing turned tragic. He came to the court of Achilles' father, King Peleus, in Phthia, where many youths were being raised alongside Achilles. But Patroclus was different. He became Achilles' closest companion, his dearest friend. They trained together, fought together, and eventually sailed together to Troy. Throughout the first 9 years of the Trojan War, Patroclus served as Achilles' companion and aide. He was not primarily a combatant himself. He was more of an attendant to Achilles, someone who managed the camp, organized supplies, and served as both strategic advisor and emotional support to his closest friend. The relationship between the two men was profound. Achilles himself would later describe Patroclus as one he loved beyond all other companions, loved as his own life. When Achilles withdraws from the war in his anger at Agamemnon, Patroclus withdraws with him. He sits in the camp by the ships, frustrated and grieving. He wants to fight, wants to help his fellow Greeks who are dying in battle, but he is bound by loyalty to Achilles and by the understanding that Achilles' withdrawal is a calculated strategy to force recognition of his worth. But as the days pass and the Trojan victories mount, as Patroclus watches the Greeks being pushed back toward their ships, as he hears of the deaths of good men from across the Greek world, his frustration becomes almost unbearable. He approaches Achilles with a request. He asks Achilles to let him enter the battle, not as himself, but wearing Achilles' armor, the magnificent armor crafted by Hephaestus, the god of fire and forging, that is so distinctive and so renowned that simply the sight of it on the battlefield causes Trojans and Greeks alike to recognize Achilles. Patroclus' logic is simple. If he wears Achilles' armor, the Trojans will think Achilles has returned to the war. They will be terrified. The demoralized Greeks will see what they think is Achilles returning to defend them, and their spirits will rally. Patroclus can drive the Trojans back from the Greek ships, can save the fleet, and can preserve the Greek cause without Achilles having to compromise his pride. Achilles, moved by his friend's anguish, and perhaps feeling some stirring of concern for his comrades, agrees. But he sets one condition. Patroclus can go into battle, can drive back the Trojans, can defend the ships. But he must not pursue them further. He must not be drawn into an extended campaign. And above all, he must not attack Hector directly. These are important restrictions, and Achilles imposes them with a sense of foreboding, as if some part of him understands what will happen if his friend violates these boundaries. Patroclus dons Achilles' armor, and immediately the effect on the battlefield is electrifying. The Trojans, seeing what they believe is Achilles returning, falter in their assault. Even Hector, the great Trojan leader, loses confidence for a moment. The Greeks, seeing the armor they have so long missed, rally with renewed hope and ferocity. Patroclus, leading the Myrmidons, launches a devastating counterattack that drives the Trojans back from the Greek ships and prevents the burning of the Greek fleet. For a moment, it seems that his plan has worked perfectly. The Greeks are saved. The immediate crisis has passed. But Patroclus, caught up in the momentum of battle, in the intoxication of victory, in the flow of combat and the adrenaline of warfare, forgets Achilles' restrictions. Or perhaps he does not forget them so much as he finds himself unable to stop. He pursues the fleeing Trojans. He drives deeper and deeper into Trojan territory. And he encounters, inevitably, Hector himself. Now Hector knows that this is not truly Achilles. Some instinct tells him, or perhaps the gods whisper it to him, that while the armor is indeed Achilles's, the warrior inside it is someone else. And despite Patroclus' bravery and his martial skill, he is not Achilles. He is strong and talented, but he does not have quite the supernatural speed or the impossibly lethal accuracy of the demigod. In the end, after a fierce struggle, Hector's spear finds its mark. Patroclus falls. As Patroclus lies dying, Hector stands over him, and Patroclus speaks one final prophecy. He tells Hector that it is Achilles who will kill him, that even though he, Patroclus, is about to die, Hector's death is already approaching. The great Trojan knows that this is more than a taunt. It is a genuine prophecy, a glimpse of his inevitable fate. But Hector cannot back down. He will face whatever comes. When Achilles learns of Patroclus's death, something within him breaks. The wound to his pride that had driven him to withdraw from the war suddenly seems trivial, meaningless. His closest friend, the man he loved as his own life, is dead. The rage that had been directed at Agamemnon now transforms into something far more dangerous, a fury focused entirely on Hector and the Trojans. Achilles has already accepted a prophecy telling him that he will not survive the Trojan War, that he will die in Troy. He has been told that if he goes to Troy, he will achieve great glory but will die young, whereas if he remains home, he will live a long, obscure life. Knowing he will die anyway, and now burning with grief and rage over Patroclus, Achilles makes a decision. He will return to the war. He will take vengeance on Hector. He will slaughter the Trojans until they lie piled like cordwood. And if he dies doing it, so be it. At least he will die gloriously, and his name will echo through the ages. The god Hephaestus, at Achilles' mother's request, forges new armor for the grieving warrior, armor of such magnificence that it becomes almost as famous as Achilles himself. The breastplate, the shield, the spear, the greaves, all are crafted with divine artistry. The shield in particular becomes an object of legendary significance, decorated with scenes depicting the entire world, from the rise of the sun to the working of harvests, to the playing of festivals, to battles and war. Achilles, now armed with this divine equipment, returns to the battlefield. And what follows is truly apocalyptic. He rages through the Trojan forces like a force of nature, like a god incarnate. Warriors flee before him. He slaughters soldiers by the dozens, by the hundreds. The river Xanthus becomes so clogged with Trojan bodies that it rises up in protest, taking almost human form to voice its complaint at being so polluted. The gods themselves join the fray, fighting in open combat with each other as their chosen heroes clash on the mortal battlefield. Finally, Achilles encounters Hector. The two greatest warriors in the war, one Greek, one Trojan, face each other in single combat. Hector, though brave, is not Achilles' equal. The demigod's supernatural speed, his impossible strength, his training and his fury all combine to make this not a match, but a slaughter. Hector is defeated and killed. But Achilles does not simply kill him. In his grief and rage, he ties Hector's body to his chariot and drags it repeatedly around the walls of Troy, defiling the corpse of his enemy, letting all the Trojans see what he has done to their greatest hero. This desecration of Hector's body is shocking even by the standards of the Iliad, where violence is ubiquitous. It represents the depth of Achilles' grief transformed into cruelty. Only later, when Hector's elderly father, Priam, comes to Achilles' camp under a flag of truce to beg for the return of his son's body so that Hector can be properly buried and honored, does Achilles' humanity assert itself. Seeing the grief of Priam, seeing this old man who has lost so much, Achilles is moved. He returns Hector's body to the Trojans, agreeing to a temporary truce so that Hector can be properly honored in death. The Iliad ends, not with the fall of Troy, but with the funeral of Hector. It is a fitting conclusion, in a way. The focus has been not on the ultimate victory or defeat in the war, but on the tragedy that war brings, on the deaths of good men, on the grief that even victory cannot assuage. The poem is titled The Iliad because Ilium is the Greek name for Troy, and the story is about Troy and the war fought around its walls. But it is really about the cost of that war, the way that glory and honor are paid for in blood, the way that fate and prophecy hang over the heads of even the greatest warriors. The Odyssey, Homer's second epic, is in many ways a different creature entirely. Where the Iliad is focused, taking place over the course of roughly 52 days in the 10th year of the Trojan War, the Odyssey is expansive and far more varied in its locations and situations. Where the Iliad is primarily about warfare and direct combat, the Odyssey is about journeys and challenges and the tests that fate presents. After the fall of Troy, which occurs after the events of the Iliad, though Homer does not directly depict it in the earlier epic, the Greek forces begin their journey home. But Odysseus, king of the small island kingdom of Ithaca, does not go straight home. Due to circumstances partly of his own making and partly due to the wrath of the gods, his journey takes 10 years, and during those 10 years, he faces challenges and encounters monsters that test him in ways different from, but perhaps no less significant than the military trials of Troy. The Odyssey, unlike the Iliad, does not begin with Odysseus himself. Instead, it opens with a scene in the heavens, where the gods are gathered. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, speaks to the other gods about Odysseus. He has been imprisoned on an island by the nymph Calypso, who has fallen in love with him and will not let him leave. This has gone on for 7 years. Odysseus is not being punished actively, but he is being kept against his will, prevented from returning to his home and his family. Athena pleads with the other gods to intervene, to allow Odysseus to depart Calypso's island and return home. The gods agree, though not all entirely willingly. Zeus, who has some sympathy for Odysseus despite his involvement in the earlier judgment regarding Athena and Aphrodite at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, agrees to help. But before we follow Odysseus on his journey, we shift perspective. We are taken to Ithaca to see what has become of Odysseus's home in his 20-year absence. His wife, Penelope, is still waiting for him, still faithful to him, despite the assumption by many that he is dead. She has been beset by more than 100 suitors, men from across the Greek world who have come to court her and to compete for her hand in marriage, and, by extension, for the throne of Ithaca and the wealth that comes with it. Penelope has used her intelligence to delay the suitors, to refuse to choose a new husband. She has engaged in an elaborate scheme. She told them that she would marry one of them. But first, she needed to finish weaving a burial shroud for her father-in-law, Laertes. Every day she would weave, and every night she would undo her work. In this way, for 3 years, she kept them at bay. But eventually, one of her maids revealed her secret, and the suitors realized the deception. The pressure on her intensified. Penelope's son, Telemachus, has come of age during his father's absence. He was an infant when Odysseus left for Troy, and he has never actually known his father. Yet he has heard stories of Odysseus's wisdom and his cunning, and he desperately hopes that his father will somehow return. He is troubled by the invasion of his home by the suitors and by his inability, as a young man still finding his strength, to drive them out. Now, with the gods having decided to help Odysseus, Athena appears to Telemachus in disguise and encourages him to take action. She tells him to announce that the suitors are to cease their occupation of the palace, that they are to go home. She counsels him to go on a journey himself, to seek news of his father, to travel to other kings who fought at Troy, and ask if they have heard any news of Odysseus. Perhaps, she suggests, Odysseus is still alive somewhere. Telemachus does as Athena suggests. He announces that the suitors must leave. They refuse. He departs on his journey, traveling to the courts of other kings, including Menelaus and Agamemnon, and hearing stories of what befell them after Troy. Menelaus tells him of Odysseus's bravery during the Trojan War, and also mentions that he has heard rumors that Odysseus is trapped on an island with Calypso. Meanwhile, Odysseus is finally allowed to depart Calypso's island. The nymph, no longer able to keep him against the will of the gods, helps him build a raft. He sets out on the sea, determined to sail home to Ithaca. But his journey is not easy. Poseidon, god of the sea, has not forgiven Odysseus for the blinding of Polyphemus, the Cyclops, which we will discuss shortly. Poseidon sends a terrible storm that nearly drowns Odysseus. He is saved only by the intervention of divine help. A magical scarf given to him by a sea nymph allows him to survive the rough waters. He is washed ashore on the island of Scheria, home of the Phaeacians, a seafaring people. The Phaeacians, who have a reputation for hospitality, take Odysseus in and care for him. He tells them his story, and it is while recounting his adventures on the journey from Troy to Scheria that we learn of the monsters and challenges he has faced. The Cyclops is the first of these encounters. After leaving Troy, Odysseus and his men sailed to the island of the Cyclopes, giants with a single, massive eye in the center of their forehead. They are primitive creatures, more beast than civilized being, living in caves and tending flocks of sheep. Odysseus and some of his men entered one such cave, seeking perhaps shelter or supplies. Inside, they found a massive creature, Polyphemus, son of Poseidon. Polyphemus was enormous, a giant who made Odysseus and his men seem like tiny insects by comparison. The Cyclops found them in his cave and, in his primitive rage, grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men and killed them, dashing their brains against the stone floor and consuming their bodies. He then blocked the entrance to the cave with a massive boulder, trapping Odysseus and his remaining men inside. Now, Odysseus could have despaired. His men were terrified. They seemed utterly doomed. But Odysseus's great strength was not physical prowess. It was his mind, his cleverness, his ability to think through impossible situations and find a way forward. Odysseus realized that strength alone would not save them. Polyphemus was far too powerful to overcome through direct combat. So instead, Odysseus engaged the Cyclops in conversation. He asked Polyphemus what his name was, and the Cyclops answered that he was called Nomen. He spoke of his father, Poseidon, boasting that he had divine blood flowing through his veins. Then Odysseus offered Polyphemus wine, strong wine that the Greeks had brought with them. The Cyclops, who had never encountered wine before, drank deeply. The alcohol, so much stronger than anything he was accustomed to, intoxicated him rapidly. He fell into a stupor and eventually into unconsciousness. Odysseus then put his plan into action. He found a massive wooden stake inside the cave, part of an olive tree that Polyphemus had been storing. Odysseus and his men heated the point of this stake in the fire until it was glowing hot. Then they drove it directly into the Cyclops' single eye. The eye burst, and Polyphemus awoke with a scream of agony. Blinded, Polyphemus rolled away the boulder blocking the cave entrance, hoping to escape or to find water to soothe his burning eye. But Odysseus had anticipated this. Before blocking the entrance again, he had tied his men to the undersides of the massive sheep that lived in the cave. As Polyphemus rolled away the boulder and stumbled outside, the sheep fled. Clinging to the undersides of the sheep, Odysseus's men escaped the cave, while Odysseus himself held on to the largest ram. They reached their ships and began to sail away. But Odysseus, perhaps foolishly, called out to the blinded Cyclops, taunting him, revealing that his name was Odysseus, not Nomen. This was a mistake. Polyphemus, hearing Odysseus's true name, prayed to his father Poseidon, begging the sea god to curse Odysseus. He asked Poseidon to ensure that Odysseus would wander for many years before reaching home, that he would lose all his men, and that he would arrive at Ithaca broken and lonely. And Poseidon, who loved his son despite Polyphemus's primitive nature, heard the prayer and granted it. From that moment forward, Odysseus was cursed by the sea god. This curse would haunt Odysseus's journey home for the next 10 years. His sailing would be tormented. His men would die. He would encounter obstacle after obstacle. The sea itself would become his enemy. After escaping Polyphemus, Odysseus and his remaining men encountered the Laestrygonians, a race of giants, even larger than the Cyclopes. These giants were cannibals, and they attacked Odysseus's small fleet of ships. From the cliffs that surrounded the harbor where the Greeks found themselves trapped, the Laestrygonians hurled boulders of immense size down at the ships, smashing them as if they were toys. 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships were destroyed. All the men aboard those ships were killed. Only Odysseus's own ship and the men aboard it managed to escape, cutting the anchor ropes and fleeing out to sea. Odysseus, having lost most of his fleet and most of his men, sailed on with his single remaining ship and its crew. They came to the island of Aiaia, where there lived a goddess named Circe. Circe was a beautiful woman, skilled in magic. She was a divine being, descended from Helios, the sun god, and Oceanid nymphs, and she possessed powers that mortals could scarcely comprehend. Odysseus sent some of his men to explore the island, and they came upon Circe's home, a magnificent palace in the middle of the island. Circe invited them in, offering them food and drink. But the food she gave them was not innocent. Mixed into it was a magical potion, one that she had crafted specifically for this purpose. As the men ate, they began to transform. Their bodies twisted and changed. They took on characteristics of animals, pigs, in particular. Circe, laughing at their fate, imprisoned them in her palace. When Odysseus learned what had happened to his men, he determined to rescue them. He set out for Circe's palace, but on the way he was intercepted by Hermes, the messenger god, who took pity on him. Hermes gave Odysseus a magical herb called moly, which would protect him from Circe's transformative magic. Armed with this protection, Odysseus entered Circe's palace and confronted the goddess. Despite her magic, Odysseus proved immune to Circe's spells. She realized that no ordinary mortal could resist her power, and she recognized him as one of the great heroes from the Trojan War. Rather than fighting with him, she agreed to free his men and to help him. The men were restored to their human forms, and Odysseus and Circe developed a complex relationship, part adversarial, part romantic, that would last for some time. Circe provided Odysseus and his men with hospitality, rest, and advice for their continuing journey. But Odysseus could not remain indefinitely with Circe. His heart was set on home, on Ithaca, on seeing Penelope and his son again. So eventually, though Circe urged him to stay longer, Odysseus and his men prepared to depart. Before they left, however, Circe gave Odysseus crucial information about the dangers that still lay ahead. She warned him of challenges he would face, and in particular, she warned him of the sirens. The sirens were creatures of supernatural beauty and power. They were often depicted as having the heads and upper bodies of women, but the wings and lower bodies of birds. They lived on an island, and their great power was their song. The sirens sang with voices of such beauty, such perfection, that no man who heard their song could resist it. Sailors would steer their ships toward the sound of the sirens' music, drawn by an irresistible compulsion. And when their ships foundered on the rocks surrounding the sirens' island, the sirens would feed on the unfortunate sailors. Circe told Odysseus that he must not attempt to resist the sirens' song through his own willpower alone. No mortal man was strong enough to do so. Instead, she advised that he should stuff the ears of his men with beeswax, making them deaf to the song. And as for Odysseus himself, if he wished to hear the sirens' song, he could do so only if he was bound, tied securely to the mast of his ship, with explicit instructions to his men not to free him, no matter how much he pleaded or struggled. Odysseus followed Circe's advice. His men stopped their ears with wax. Odysseus was bound tightly to the mast, and then they sailed toward the sirens' island. As they approached, the sirens began to sing, and Odysseus heard the most beautiful music he had ever experienced. The sirens sang of knowledge, of wisdom, of the end to all sorrow and struggle. They sang that if he would come to them, they would grant him understanding of all things, that he would know the secrets of the universe. Odysseus struggled against his bonds, desperate to go to the sirens, to join them, to abandon his journey home, and simply exist in that beautiful music forever. He begged his men to free him, to untie the ropes. But his men, their ears blocked with wax, could not hear his pleas. They maintained their course, sailing past the sirens' island. Gradually, as the ship moved farther away, the song faded. Odysseus's desperate desire to reach the sirens diminished, and he was saved. Later versions of the myth suggest that the sirens, having been unable to capture Odysseus, were so devastated by their failure that they threw themselves into the sea and drowned. There were several famous singers of ancient mythology, and all of them were said to have been sirens or the offspring of sirens, each one having failed to resist in their own way. After passing the sirens, Odysseus faced another trial, the strait between Scylla and Charybdis. This was perhaps the most genuinely no-win scenario that any hero has had to face. On one side of a narrow strait lived Scylla, a monster with 6 heads, each with 3 rows of sharp teeth and with 12 tentacle-like limbs. She lived in a cave in a rocky cliff overlooking the water. Opposite her, on the other side of the strait, lurked Charybdis, a whirlpool of apocalyptic proportions. 3 times each day, Charybdis would suck down an enormous amount of water, creating a vortex powerful enough to pull down entire ships. And then, 3 times each day, she would belch the water back out again, creating waves large enough to inundate the surrounding area. The strait was so narrow that any ship attempting to navigate it could not avoid both dangers. If one tried to pass too close to Scylla to avoid Charybdis, Scylla's tentacles would reach out and snatch sailors from the deck. If one tried to pass too close to Charybdis to avoid Scylla, the whirlpool would drag the entire ship underwater and destroy it utterly. Circe had advised Odysseus that if he had to choose, it was better to lose some men to Scylla than to lose the entire ship to Charybdis. It was a horrible choice, but it was the only rational option. So Odysseus steered his ship closer to Scylla, and as he did, the monster reached out and grabbed 6 of his men. The men screamed as the tentacles pulled them into Scylla's cave, and they were devoured. It was a horrific moment, and Odysseus grieved for his fallen men. But the ship survived. They passed through the strait. After this, Odysseus's fleet encountered another challenge. They came to an island where cattle of the sun god Helios grazed. The god had forbidden anyone to touch these cattle under pain of terrible punishment. But Odysseus's men, exhausted and hungry, wanted to slaughter some of the cattle and eat them. Odysseus begged them not to do so, reminding them of the god's prohibition. But they convinced him to let them land and rest. And while resting, they killed some of the cattle. Helios, seeing his sacred cattle being slaughtered, was enraged. He appealed to Zeus to punish Odysseus and his men. Zeus agreed. When the men set sail again, the god sent a storm that battered the ship. It was destroyed, and all of Odysseus's men were killed. Only Odysseus himself survived, clinging to wreckage, eventually being washed ashore on Calypso's island, where he would spend the next 7 years imprisoned in luxury and captivity. All of this history, all of these monsters and challenges, is what Odysseus recounts to the Phaeacians as he tells them his story. The Phaeacians, deeply moved by his tale, provide him with ships and supplies to complete his final journey to Ithaca. They send him off with gifts and blessings. Odysseus finally arrives in Ithaca, but he does not immediately reveal himself. Athena, his divine protector, disguises him as a beggar, an old man in tattered clothes. In this disguise, he enters his own palace, where the suitors are still occupying the space, still courting his wife, still consuming his wealth. He observes them, sees how they treat him, and devises a plan. Penelope, though 20 years have passed, and though many believe Odysseus must be dead, has not given up hope entirely. She has been studying the suitors, trying to determine which of them might be worthy of her hand should her husband truly be gone forever. She devises one final test. She tells the suitors that she will marry the man who can accomplish a feat of strength. She has an ancient bow of Odysseus, a massive weapon that requires extraordinary strength to draw. She will marry the man who can string the bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axes arranged in a line. The suitors, one by one, attempt the feat and fail. None of them are strong enough to draw the bow. Then Odysseus, still in his disguise as a beggar, asks to try. The suitors mock him, but Odysseus eventually persuades them to let him attempt it. The old beggar takes the bow and with almost casual ease strings it. He then shoots an arrow, and it flies true, passing through all 12 axes. With this feat accomplished, Odysseus reveals himself. He casts off his disguise, and his true identity is exposed. The suitors realize the danger they are in. Odysseus, having been proven as the one worthy through his strength and skill, can now legitimately claim to be Penelope's husband and the rightful king of Ithaca. What follows is a slaughter. Odysseus and his son Telemachus, aided by loyal servants, cut down the suitors one by one. It is a bloody reckoning, but it is also a necessary restoration of order. After the suitors are dead, Odysseus is reunited with Penelope. But Penelope, cautious and wise, is not entirely convinced that this man is truly her husband. 20 years is a long time, and an impostor could easily claim to be Odysseus. So she devises one final test. She orders her servants to move the marriage bed from the royal chamber. She wants to see the reaction of the man claiming to be her husband. And here, Odysseus speaks a crucial detail. The bed, he says, cannot be moved. One of its legs is made from a living olive tree, still rooted in the ground. It was part of the bed's construction, inseparable from it. Only Odysseus would know this detail, for he had built the bed himself when they were first married. Penelope, hearing this verification, finally accepts that the man before her is truly her husband. They are reunited, and the long separation that had defined so much of both their lives comes to an end. The Odyssey concludes with Odysseus and Penelope being restored to their proper places. The disorder that had overtaken Ithaca in Odysseus's absence, the occupation of the suitors, the tension with Telemachus, the uncertainty about the future, is restored to order. Athena even appears at the end of the epic and uses her power to impose a lasting peace, to ensure that the vendetta and violence do not escalate further. It is a conclusion that emphasizes restoration, renewal, and the triumph of loyalty and cunning over brute force and time. Now, as we step back and consider both of these epics together, we see that they explore similar themes through very different lenses. Both concern the Trojan War directly or indirectly, the Iliad through the war itself, the Odyssey through its aftermath. Both feature heroes who are tested by impossible circumstances. Both feature divine intervention, with the gods playing crucial roles in shaping events. Both explore the relationship between fate and free will, between individual desires and collective obligations. But there are crucial differences as well. The Iliad is focused on a moment of crisis, a 50-day span in the 10th year of a 10-year war. It is tightly constructed, with careful attention to military detail and the choreography of combat. It is a poem about youth, about glory, about the price of war paid in blood and grief. The Odyssey, by contrast, is expansive, covering a much broader span of time and space. It is a poem about maturity, about returning home, about the wisdom that comes through suffering and wandering. The monsters in the two epics also reflect their different concerns. The monsters of the Iliad, if we can call the great warriors and divine beings that oppose the heroes monsters, are primarily external opponents. Hector is not a monster in the sense of being subhuman or supernatural, though he is a great warrior. The true supernatural forces in the Iliad are the gods themselves, intervening in human affairs. The monsters Odysseus encounters in the Odyssey, by contrast, are often more grotesque, more purely antagonistic to human civilization and human values. The Cyclops is a savage creature, barely civilized, interested only in consuming human flesh. The sirens are seductive but deadly, representing temptation and the danger of pursuing beauty or knowledge at the cost of one's fundamental mission. Scylla and Charybdis represent forces of nature that seem almost indifferent to human concerns, yet which demand human choice and sacrifice. The heroes of the two epics are also different in important ways. Achilles is driven by pride, by the desire for glory, by a willingness to sacrifice anything, even his own life, even the welfare of his comrades, in pursuit of honor and the assurance that his name will be remembered. He is a tragic hero in the classical sense, brought down ultimately by the very traits that make him great. Odysseus, by contrast, is driven by a desire for home, for reunion with his loved ones, for the restoration of order and normalcy. He is willing to suffer, to endure, to be patient. Where Achilles is active and aggressive, Odysseus is often reactive, finding his way through problems by thinking rather than by direct confrontation. And then there is Penelope, a figure of equal importance to the male heroes, representing virtues of a different sort: loyalty, fidelity, intelligence, patience, and the kind of strength that persists quietly rather than exploding dramatically. She waits 20 years for her husband, resisting the pressure of the suitors, maintaining hope and faith despite overwhelming odds suggesting that Odysseus is dead. When she finally is reunited with him, it is not through any military victory or dramatic confrontation, but through recognition and remembrance, through the knowledge that only true husband and wife would possess. The legacy of Homer's epics cannot be overstated. For more than 25 centuries, they have been studied, interpreted, adapted, and reinterpreted. They have influenced virtually every major work of Western literature that came after them. The Aeneid, Virgil's Roman epic, was explicitly modeled on Homer's works and continued the story beyond Troy's fall. Medieval romances and modern novels continue to draw on Homeric themes and structures. The psychology of Achilles has informed countless explorations of rage and pride. The patience and cunning of Odysseus have made him a symbol of human resilience and intelligence. But beyond their literary influence, Homer's epics have shaped how we understand heroism itself. Before Homer, heroism may have been something else entirely, perhaps primarily martial prowess, or the accumulation of wealth and power. But Homer showed us that heroism involved not just strength, but also intelligence, not just victory, but also suffering, not just individual achievement, but also the cost of that achievement in terms of human loss and grief. He showed us heroes who are flawed, who make terrible mistakes, who are often trapped by circumstances beyond their control, and yet they endure, they struggle, they maintain their honor and their loyalty, even in the face of impossible odds. The monsters of Homer's epics function in much the same way. They are not simply evil beings to be destroyed. They are obstacles that reveal character, that test the hero's ingenuity and courage. The Cyclops forces Odysseus to think rather than to fight. Scylla and Charybdis force him to make impossible choices. The sirens test his commitment to his goal of reaching home. None of these monsters are randomly encountered. They are placed on the hero's path as trials, as examinations of character. And ultimately, that is perhaps the greatest legacy of Homer, the understanding that life itself is a kind of epic journey, filled with obstacles and challenges that test us in fundamental ways. The monsters we face may be external, the genuine dangers and difficulties that exist in the world. But they may also be internal, the pride that keeps us from reconciling with others, the desire for immediate gratification that prevents us from reaching our goals, the despair that tempts us to abandon hope. Homer shows us that the heroes who endure are not necessarily the strongest or the most talented. Achilles is stronger than Hector, but Hector's nobility endures in memory, in a way that makes Achilles' superiority seem less significant. Odysseus is not the strongest warrior, but his cunning and determination enable him to survive when stronger men perish. And Penelope's quiet loyalty proves to be as important to the epic's resolution as any military victory. As you continue your own journey through life, remember the lessons of Homer. Remember that heroism is not always about dramatic confrontations and great victories. Sometimes it is about patience, about loyalty, about thinking your way through impossible situations. Remember that the monsters you encounter may be tests designed to reveal who you truly are. And remember that the greatest glory is not found in conquest or dominion over others, but in the honor with which you face your challenges and the loyalty with which you treat those you love. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the ancient world of Homer, into the glory and the tragedy, the wisdom and the sorrow of the Iliad and the Odyssey. These stories have endured for so long because they speak to something fundamental in the human experience. They remind us that we are capable of great things, but also that we are vulnerable to fate and circumstance. They show us that the pursuit of honor and glory carries a price, and that sometimes the greatest victory is simply making it home. If you've found value in tonight's exploration of Greek mythology and heroic literature, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe to the Mythic Nightfall channel. Your support helps us continue to bring these stories to life, to explore the myths that have shaped human consciousness for millennia. Share this episode with anyone you think might be moved by the tales of Achilles and Hector, of Odysseus and Penelope, of the monsters they faced and the trials they endured. Thank you for settling in with us tonight, for taking this journey with me through the ancient world. May your own journey be filled with wisdom, with courage, and with the kind of loyalty and love that Homer's heroes exemplified. Until next time, this is Mythic Nightfall, reminding you to embrace the darkness, because that is where the deepest magic resides.